John Stuart Mill is what I meant by mill. And we do have a nice section in the text, if you had a chance to look at it. Quiz question that I usually ask is, fill in the quote, the rest of the quote. And the quote goes, better to be a human dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. And then comes the rest of it. Better to be a Socrates dissatisfied than a blank satisfied. That's one of those famous quotes. You could just look it up. You don't even need the text. But what is the blank? And along with that is a question. So for example, if you say, better to be a human dissatisfied than a pig satisfied, how many of you would actually rather be a happy pig than a dissatisfied human? I get that response pretty frequently, and it surprises me because there's no way I'd change my life as a human being for that of a pig, just because the pig was happily wallowing in mud. Especially when I see pigs at the state fair, and they've got their ribbons and they've got the price per pound above their head. You know, that happy pig has no clue.
Exactly.
What awaits that
we
pig?
know we're going to die. We're like aware of our mortality. Pigs are just chilling in mud. They have their own like death certificate.
I don't know if they're conscious, or I know they're conscious, right? You know, animals are conscious, but are they self-conscious, self-aware? That seems to require a language that enables me to have conceptions of what I think of as myself, and to be self-reflective so that I can, the mirror effect, so-called, right? So there's all kinds of interesting requirements for that.
Wait, does that mean that people who are like use sign language, I guess they can transfer it to a language? I'm just
Well, that's a good question, because I don't know. I've had some interesting interrelationships with people who use sign language because they are deaf.
Yeah.
Not just because they studied ESL, because they're afraid to death of learning a foreign language. Sorry about that, if you did that. Foreign languages are no big deal. It's just another vocabulary. The main icebreaker is you have to get over the idea of mumbling nonsense, not knowing what the heck you're saying and hoping for the best, Just get over that and you're fine.
Just get over that, the grammar though, and sentence.
Ich spreche auf Deutsch, io говорю по-русски, je parle français, io parlo italiano. Whatever, right? It makes no difference. They're all just human languages. That's right. And when you figure, I started out talking like this because I'm from Philly, Hey, Hunter. Voidi, entrez. Come in. Well, that's, you can have fun with it. I'm not sure how many languages John Stuart Mill spoke. That would be interesting. His father, James Mill, had a very weird take on education and educated his son, John Stuart, at home. And it was a very intense education. In fact, it drove John Stuart Mill to an emotional breakdown when he was in his early 20s. So it's, and I wonder if one of the causes of that is that you need a meta-narrative, a story that gives you a sense of your purpose in life and gives you your goals, gives you your what should I do when I wake up this morning kind of thing. That comes housed, so to speak, in a story, a meta-narrative, a narrative that is the narrative that explains all the other smaller narratives in your life, right? I mean, there's lots of them. How to be the best father you can be, you know, how to be a best husband, how to be a good citizen, how to be a good teacher, how to be a good Christian, how to be a good human being, how to be a good thrifty shopper, you know, a snazzy but not too snazzy dresser, you know, how to be polite, you know, why to be polite. I mean, if you think about it, all of these are explained in story form. Little stories, bigger stories, but we end up, of course, with conflicts between the various stories, and so we need a bigger story that prioritizes the smaller stories so that we know how to reconcile those conflicts, right? Otherwise, you're stuck whether you want to eat the candy bar or not, right? You have to know what's important. And what's important comes from the bigger story that you believe. And John Stuart Mill's father didn't teach him, I'm not sure, but I don't think he taught him a story. In fact, I think he taught him the opposite of a story. He taught him that all the traditional stories were false. So basically, he was one of those liberal experiments where his parents tried to raise him without any of the traditional values. I mean, obviously, he's loaded with values. There were values. The family was part of a group of friends. One of the friends is Jeremy Bentham, was Jeremy Bentham. For example. And Jeremy Bentham is the founder of modern utilitarianism, which in a sense is very hedonistic. In fact, hedon is a measurement of pleasure. And Jeremy Bentham comes up with what he referred to as the hedonistic calculus. In other words, if you're going to have to make a decision about something to do, what you do is you account for all of the hedons in the choices that you have. You know, what pleasures would this do, what pleasures... So, for example, in the summer, the end of the summer, when it's time for the state fair, one of the things my family would always want to do is go to the state fair. You know, the kids would love to get on the rides. Everybody would like to eat the crappy food. You know, maybe buy a few dumb things. My wife especially would love to go and see the quilt show, which I think is one of the most boring things a person can do. Sit there and watch someone talking about the various quilts that, you know, etc. My wife loves that sort of thing. The only quilt I ever saw that I really was fascinated by was one that was made up of a whole bunch of Crown Royal bags. So, you know, Crown Royal comes in a beautiful blue bag. I'm not sure it makes the alcohol worthwhile, but I remember being absolutely astounded once seeing this great, big, beautiful quilt made with these huge Crown Royal bags, and I thought, what? Where did those come from? Because whenever I had bought a bottle of Crown Royal, the envelope, the bag was, you know, about this big. These were like 3 times that size. So the next time I was in the boozery, I checked, and sure enough, they have larger sizes of Crown Royal. Amazing. And by the way, I've been collecting the bags ever since. I don't know if it will eventually turn into a quilt, but you know, that's me. But the family would want to go to the fair, but I would much rather sit on the back deck of the house in the sunshine reading Hegel. So if I were to measure the hedons, scribble on the board, so I would get 100 hedons of pleasure from sitting on the deck all afternoon reading Hegel. But now, how do I decide? Should we stay home and me study Hegel and all of the kids and Donna be upset because they didn't get to do their favorite thing at the fair? Or what hedons would we get if we went to the fair? Well, each of the kids would have maybe 25 hedons of pleasure, and my wife would have 50. You see how I measure my hedons, right? I get 100, Donna gets 50, they each get 25, so I'm obviously patriarchal, right? So I'm trying to, well, how do you figure out hedons? How much is a hedon of pleasure, I suppose one of the highest possible measurements would be an orgasm. How many hedons do you get from an orgasm? The pig, by the way, has a much longer orgasm than human beings. Let me double check that, see if that's still true. How long is a pig's orgasm? That's even up there. 30 minutes. Wow. It adds a lot more weight to the question, which would you rather be, a happy pig or a dissatisfied human, right? I'm amazed that when people say they'd rather be a pig, because after all, human beings are the top of the food chain, aren't we? We're the top of the chain of life. I mean, that's at least what the medieval picture of the great chain of being was. That on the top was God, next to that were the angels, and after that were humans, human beings, right? Because we have the same kind of souls that the angels are, but we also have a body, so we're lower than the angels because we have that body attached to our soul. But of all the animals, none of the other animals have a soul, so we're the highest of the animals. That's the medieval view of the great chain of being. Obviously, some people feel like they'd rather be a happy pig. I don't know. I think they can say that just being funny. But remember, the second part of that question and the quiz question is the follow-up that John Stuart Mill gives us, and that is better to be a dissatisfied Socrates than a happy blank. Fill in the gap there. Back to Jeremy Bentham. How do you figure out what a hedon is, and can you create a hedonistic calculus so that you can basically decide, okay, there's more hedons of pleasure if we go to the fair than if I sit home and read Hegel. So we have to go to the fair. That's the decision, right? And make that based on utility. What pleasures would accumulate to the family if we do the one thing rather than the other? Can you make legal decisions based on that kind of hedonistic calculus? Should we have, for example, a universal basic income? Right? Are you familiar with that concept?
Oh my god. Yeah, like Andrew Lang or whatever, the guy running for president right now. Or Anthony Lang.
We're going to get an ad first.
So is universal basic income a sensible safety net or an economic disaster in the making? Now, perhaps surprisingly, Charles Murray, a scholar at the American Enterprise Institute, is an advocate. And I spoke to him about it recently. Have a look. Charles, thank you so much for talking to us about this. I was very excited when I heard that we could have this conversation because for most people, this idea of a universal basic income is something that's associated with the left. More recently, we've had the liberal elite in Silicon Valley pushing the idea, but generally it's something that's seen as an idea that comes from the left. But you're obviously not from the left, far from it.
No.
Just make the case for this from the point of view.
Well, the simplest case from the conservative point of view is that the current system is awful, and replacing it all just by giving people money is better. That was Milton Friedman's argument. He made this case a long time ago. That's part of my reason, but the main reason is, well, I got a couple. One is I think we're going to see a revolution in the job market over the next 20 or 30 years that are going to require us to redefine what the meaning of a job is. I'm in a minority on that. I have a lot of economist friends who say this time is not different and so forth, but I believe that. The second thing is that we've got to revive American civil society. And by civil society, I mean communities solving their own problems, dealing with each other, all the things that made America a very special place for decades and decades, which is disappearing. And oddly enough, a universal basic income, I think, can give a big boost to revitalizing that.
So explain that a bit more, because people might say it's almost the opposite of that.
So, what's the utility, really, of having this idea? Notice he's contrasting that with the current system. If we look at the current system and we see how much the state gives to people and how that money is supposed to help them in the various kinds of things they do, whether it's medical or food or rent, things of that sort, or if we give them instead a universal basic income where they can distribute the money as they see fit. If you follow this argument, and especially from his perspective, this is one more opportunity really for intelligent individuals who are getting this basic income to pool their resources with family so that they basically have way more than just one income, right? To have like a house and have things of that sort. But it would also mean that you would no longer be getting help with all the other things. So you would have to be able to be smart enough to use that income in a way that would enable you to do well. And that means that the more intelligent people are going to have it better off as a result of this possible switch to a different kind of social net, safety net. And it is interesting, of course, to get into the argument over the nature of work. What kind of jobs are going to be available? Even McDonald's, kind of the joke that we make, that you end up, with an arts degree, you end up working for McDonald's, right? You've heard the joke, right? Right. So even those jobs are going away because McDonald's is replacing the cashiers with kiosks, right? So that's going to, they're going to decrease that. We've seen that when companies go to technologies they replace workers, they make their product more efficient, they do it faster, etc. But at the same time, they use less and less human beings to do the work, etc. So that's kind of an interesting thing. So of course, this whole argument is framed in the context of utility. How do you figure out what things will be better? What the changing in the laws will do? Will that help or make things worse? Right? And we could try it for a while. Interesting thing right here locally is when the legislature passed a change in the way the criminal code was used, how long would people be in jail, and so on. There are a lot of changes made with the idea that it would actually save money but achieve a better result. Almost immediately, what a lot of people started complaining about was it seemed that crime went up. Of course, it was complicated because other things were happening at the time, so it wasn't clear that it was just the changes in the criminal code that had brought that about, etc. Right? So there's a lot of conflict over how you measure these things and so on. By the way, the folks that were in the legislature that made those changes are still there. And so even though the governor was hoping to change the law, notice that they're absolutely refusing to do that. They'll change it incrementally because they still want to be smart. So they still want to look at science, social sciences. They're soft sciences, they're not as accurate, but at the same time, the goal is a utilitarian one, to improve the way money is spent in the state, to get the results we want, and improve those results, and so on. So if you think about it, this is all in it. I mean, it sounds funny, but it's like we're using a hedonistic calculus in order to try to figure out how to do things. But what is the overall goal? I mentioned that I don't think James Mill was teaching his son a meta-narrative, clearly not a traditional meta-narrative, to give him a sense of the overall purpose of life. And essentially, why would that be? Well, this is an evolutionary narrative. If you think of evolution as essentially the Hegelian evolution of being, and notice that John Stuart Mill, what happened to Mill? Well, something, before I do that, I wanted to show you a really odd thing about Jeremy Bentham. Jeremy Bentham died, but notice he is still attending the Board of Regents for the University of London. As part of his will, he donated to the university, but his requirement was that he continue to be a member of the board and attend the meetings. And so they have his body kept there at the university. This is at the doorway as you come in the library of the university. And there he is, sitting there on a stool in a glass booth, and you notice that this whole glass booth comes out of there. It's on wheels, and they wheel that into the Regents' meetings so that he's still attending the meetings. By the way, that's a wax head on the real body, and this picture doesn't look very good, but that right there should be his real head, which doesn't look very good. But you can't see it in this picture. There are other pictures, though, where you can see it. I think you can see it in this. Oh, there it is.
And they went on tour recently, too.
Oh, did it?
Yeah. They came to New York.
The body?
His head.
Oh, the head.
That's the part that they're studying. Yeah, it went on tour.
Huh, I hadn't heard that.
Yeah.
But I have had students who've graduated from UAA who went on tour in London and
they saw
have sent me selfies of them standing there with Jeremy Bentham. So that's pretty cool.
Yeah, they didn't used to have him in that case. But too many people kept on doing selfies and touching it.
I don't know when they... This is in kind of a crappy hallway.
Yeah.
There's like the food store is down the one side and the registration is down the other. But, so it's
still at the passing.
so it's not an especially... it's not like Lenin, with the tomb in Red Square with all the, so... Well, that's all right. So I don't know how I got into that. Let me see if I can get So Jeremy Bentham. And so what is the overall goal? It sounds almost like the concept of freedom for Hegel. He does away with all the other narratives, but there's still this overall narrative of the progress of history, and that progress is obviously heading towards some value. Otherwise, how could you call it progress? And that value for Hegel is freedom, and with Bentham, the overall value is the greatest happiness of the greatest number. You see it right here. So this is the fundamental axiom. The greatest happiness of the greatest number. And now, when you think about the quiz question, and you ask, well, okay, so what is the difference between a happy pig and a dissatisfied human? You're going to have to figure out, well, how do you measure happiness? And is the human's happiness, which is not a satisfied human being, but a dissatisfied human being, compare that to a happy pig. If you're looking for the greatest happiness, shouldn't we all be happy pigs? Well, the answer is no, because in Bentham's way of viewing things, and John Stuart Mill as well, humans have a greater kind of happiness than pigs. Being human is higher on that chain of being. So they're still in that, what Peter Singer might call speciesism, right? It's okay to sacrifice rabbits so that we find out if these chemicals will hurt our skin or our eyes. So we'll put rabbits in cages and use them as lab animals to try salves on their eyes to see if it makes their eyes better or not. And obviously, if sometimes it doesn't, oh well, the poor rabbit. But as far as the chemists are concerned, they're saving humans the pain of discovering that salve was not a good salve to put on your eye for pink eye or whatever, right? So we're torturing, basically, these other animals with the goal of the greater good. Wow, that sounds like Voldemort, doesn't it? Right? It does, actually. Actually, the new movies are, who's the evil guy in the Grindelwald, right?
Oh.
How come you guys are not up to date on Harry Potter?
That's not Harry Potter, that's fake.
That's fake?
The new Harry Potter movies aren't the legit Harry Potter movies.
Oh, okay.
They're a franchise that's trying to make money.
And J.K. Rowling was not trying to make money?
She was trying to make money, but it originated with the books, and now she's like getting away from the plot of the books and just trying to make money off of the movies. It's not like the story of the books into the movies. I get triggered.
Okay. So by the way, I would definitely say that, even though that was just a joke, that the plot element of the evil folks in the Harry Potter series, talking about the greater good, is a utilitarian motif. So I'm making a joke, but at the same time, that's a serious point, really, that utilitarianism as a philosophy is a very important British philosophy. In fact, we could say, what's the difference between utilitarianism and pragmatism? Basically, no difference. Pragmatism is the American version of utilitarianism, which we usually associate with the British. But the greatest good for the greatest number. you've got an incredible set of problems in trying to figure out what that means. Should we be concerned about the other animals? Yes. And that's where Peter Singer comes into play. Here's Peter Singer
starting
talking
with
about
animal rights. A lot in your work, a lot of your positions about animal rights stems from a notion of equality. So why is equality so important when viewing both humanity and other animals in the animal kingdom?
Okay, before I answer the question, I want to make just one little pedantic point.
Absolutely.
Some of you just heard me say that if we take a rights approach to human rights, it becomes difficult to decide what set of human rights we have. Julie, you talked about animal rights there, and of course the same would apply to that. Do animals have rights? What rights do they have? Although people very frequently describe me as an animal rights advocate, as you just did, and that's fine from the point of view of taking a political stance. People will know what side I'm on, where I am. Philosophically, I'm not an animal rights advocate because I don't think that rights is the appropriate terminology to think about the issue. I would think of it in terms of the question that you specifically asked me, in terms of equality, equality between humans and animals in a very specific sense. Because again, it's obvious that humans and animals are not politically equal. We couldn't give them the right to vote. But there's a sense in which I think they do share an important equality, and that is the capacity to suffer or to enjoy their lives. And I think that ought to lead to a moral equality in the sense that I think their pain ought to count just as much as the pain of a human being, where it's a similar amount of pain. Conversely, their pleasure ought to count just as much if we can see it as a similar amount of pleasure. So what I'm opposing here is discounting or ignoring the pains and suffering of beings simply because they're not members of our species. And that's the sense in which I want to extend equality beyond the species boundary. I want to say that we should give equal consideration to the interests of all beings that have interests, all beings, for example, that can feel pain, irrespective of their species, just as everybody now agrees we should give equal consideration to the interests of human beings, irrespective of their race or sex. So it's that kind of equality that I want to argue for, and I think that leads to significant changes. Of course, it does also lead to interesting questions about what interests do animals have, where they're different from human interests, how do we compare those different interests. All of that is still questions that we need to discuss.
So Peter Singer, he's an example of a utilitarian today. And notice this issue regarding pigs, chickens, other animals as one of his main concerns, animal liberation, etc. And the way he looks at it is the fact that animals can feel pain, they can suffer, and as a result, we ought not to increase their suffering. And he's looking at the same fundamental principle of utility, and that is that we ought to increase happiness and decrease pain and suffering, right? And not just human pain and suffering, but it should be in general, right? Anything that can suffer. Computers, if you upload a program, from the iOS of Apple, the computer won't like it. But we don't worry about the computer being, suffering pain, right? So that's not an issue. But animals, yes. Of course, the argument is, well, what about food? Since we eat them, the wonderful thing about pigs is that they taste delicious, right? Bacon, etc. And John Stuart Mill will point out, a lot of people criticize him by saying that humans, in this sense, are no different than a happy pig. The goal of life should be just happiness. Well, happy pigs, why are we different? And for John Stuart Mill, human beings have a higher quality of nature, so the kind of happiness and suffering that humans have is of higher quality. But it's not just there. It's also between other humans. So if you look at the second part of that quiz question, what is the blank to fill in? And you'll see it's a class issue. Socrates is in a particular class. As far as Mill is concerned, Socrates is an intelligent individual. There's certainly lots of non-intelligent individuals that are also human. And the question is, should laws be made so that the intelligent people get the benefit? Or should they be made so that everyone, whether they're intelligent or not, have that kind of equal benefit? And Mill is not an advocate for that. He's an elitist. He is in favor of poor people getting help. In fact, if we think, okay, who else exists at the same time as John Stuart Mill? Charles Dickens is another. And when we think about Charles Dickens' literature, Charles Dickens, we think about Hard Times. Well, actually, I don't want to read the whole book, but obviously Hard Times is a book that Charles Dickens wrote, and is about most interesting analysis of it that I read considers the main character, what's his name? Gladgrind, Mr. Gladgrind. That sounds terrible, right? Which is the point, right? Gladgrind. He grinds he enjoys grinding his workers, and making them work. In the end, he ends up getting screwed himself. And that's part of the point, actually. Who was the possible individual that Charles Dickens had in mind? People say that it was Malthus, Thomas Malthus, Reverend Thomas Malthus, who, as a precursor to Charles Darwin, but remember the Hegelian philosophy is already available and in England, and it is an evolutionary kind of philosophy. Hasn't been applied to biology yet, but Malthus applies it to economics and argues based on the principle of population, the idea that human population grows at a certain rate because of how many children a typical family will have, or at least did back then. But the amount of food that we can produce is limited to a certain amount, and so what happens is routinely the population of an area will outpace its ability to feed itself, and as a result of that there will be famine and plague and war and things of that sort, and that will kill the population off enough that it brings it back down to where the population can now feed itself again, and then that whole process starts again. So it goes through these cycles, right? Very pessimistic theory. By the way, the British actually used that theory to decide not to help during the Irish potato famine. So they let the Irish starve to death, even though there was plenty of food in Ireland that the British owned and could have used to feed them, but they wanted to make their profit, so they didn't feed the Irish, with the theory that it's just nature taking its course. We should just let the Irish starve, after all. There's too many of them, etc. Of course, that's one of the reasons why so many of the Irish went to the colonies, or well, the United States at the time. So this kind of philosophy, this kind of thinking is Malthusian, by the way. And of course, a lot of people will point out that Malthus was wrong. The world could feed way more people than he thought. But it does seem, at least to me, that the argument is still essentially there, that there's a limit to how much the human population can be supported by our agricultural production. Obviously, they're feeding way more people than ever today, although I'm scared to death of the kind of food we're eating, because I made the mistake of reading The Omnivore's Dilemma, which I think I've mentioned before, scariest book I ever read. Thank you, Michael Pollan. By the way, this is his new book, How to Change Your Mind, which I just started. I think I mentioned that. I still haven't gotten very far. But The Omnivore's Dilemma, what kind of food are we eating? I am not the same kind of carbon as my parents, because the food that I've been eating has been fertilized by petroleum products. And so instead of carbon-3, my body is made out of carbon-4. I'm an experiment. In a sense, I'm not even human. I'm more plastic than I am human, I guess. Okay, so Charles Dickens' target in Hard Times, his novel, is Thomas Robert Malthus, critics say, because of his but you know other ones. Oliver, right? You know this one, right?
Please, sir, I want some more.
You can. You know, this was based on Oliver Twist, another book by Charles Dickens.
Please, sir, I want some more.
What?
Please, sir, I want some more.
More? Snatch it! Hold it! Start it! Crouch it! Pick him up and bounce him!
Did you see the sign, God is Love?
Before we take a little time, That's who he is. Oliver, Oliver, never before has a boy wanted more. Oliver, Oliver.
So Oliver Twist. The musical is Oliver. But, I mean, the obvious moral point that Dickens and the musical is trying to make is that these kids in the workhouse are poor and they're being abused. They're not given enough food, they're not given pleasant living conditions. Children shouldn't be treated that way, and it's just because they're the orphans, in the community, etc. Right? By the way, this is also a movie that supports ends, as does the book, Oliver Twist, because the boy Oliver turns out to be a orphan who was the son of the daughter of a rich family that got lost. And of course, he has a natural cuteness and all sorts of, he turns out to be such a wonderful boy that he ends up being, of course, taken care of. And that magically that family actually figures out that he's their grandson or whatever, and gets him back at the end. So at the end of the movie, of course, he's back in the arms of the wealthy family again, etc. So remember, tie this in Harry Potter. Harry Potter has something in his blood, right? He's magical, right? He's a mistreated orphan, but lo and behold, his ability will be out. We can expect great things from you, etc. Right? The same sort of thing happens with Oliver. And if you think about it, here's that John Stuart Mill's sense that the elite deserve better. All of the poor should be treated better, but of all of the poor, the elite deserve even better than what the poor get. So that's an interesting dilemma there. Remember another Dixon, how do you say it? Dixonian? No, Dixonian would be the poet Emily Dickinson, right? No, for Charles Dickens. He's also famous for, remember, the Christmas Carol, right? Where Ebenezer Scrooge, right? Another interesting name. He's the boss, that has Bob Cratchit as an employee and treats him poorly. And of course, the end result of the ghost's visits and so on is that he realizes the error of his ways and starts treating his employees better. Yes? So you can see there's a pattern associated with Charles Dickens and his novels. Also, at the same time that John Stuart Mill publishes his book On Liberty, which, by the way, is where the concept of a liberal begins. So, On Liberty, John Stuart Mill. Am I still under? So this is the work that frames. But now remember, this is the concept of a liberal that is a conservative liberal today. So not a liberal in the sense of, say, Bernie Sanders or others that represent that, what we would consider the left today. It's clearly not Marxian, right? So if you think of communism and Marxism as the left, that's definitely not where John Stuart Mill is. He is an MP for, I think, one term, a member of Parliament for 4 years. His lifetime though, his lifetime work is with the East India Company, and he doesn't go to India. He spends his time working in an office in London, which, if you look up pictures, you can see the window of his office where he overlooked town. Every day he would have exactly the same tea and buns or whatever they were that the office supplied people at I think 10 o'clock, etc. So a very routine kind of life for his time there. Marries Harriet Taylor, and between the two of them they write on feminism, but On Liberty. And On Liberty is published in 1859. Does it say that anywhere? There it is, 1859. And if we look at another major work that's published at the same time, notice, same cover, in fact. Why is that? Is that the inside, not the cover? The title page. Notice the date. What time? What year did I say that On Liberty was published?
1859.
And that's the same year as The Origin of the Species, right? So notice that this seems to be a trend, right? If you think of it, right? You know, if we think Hegel's book, The Phenomenology of Mind or Spirit, comes out in 1807, and here, and we know that both Charles Darwin's grandfather was for evolution. We notice that Bentham is for evolution, and James Mill is for evolution, but what they're talking about is evolving culture, evolving in the Hegelian sense. But it becomes, it's a paradigm shift, as Thomas Kuhn would say, and so that overall narrative then begins being applied to other things. So in this case, it's applied to biology, right? The recognition that Darwin comes in arguing that species literally evolve, etc., right? By the way, I think the best current book, even though it's not current, is Stephen Jay Gould. And he's got lots of really great works out there. Died early, he was only in his 60s. But the book, The Structure of Evolutionary Theory, where is it? You see it anywhere? Structure of Evolutionary Theory. So this book is, it's a huge tome, but it's fantastic. So when we go back to Darwin, obviously evolutionary theory has come a long way from Darwin. But even so, when we look at Darwin, what we're looking at is that paradigm shift to that organic growing model of not just human culture, as Hegel would describe it, right? And talk about history and philosophy and its evolutionary progress. But what we see with Darwin, of course, is biology evolving. What we see in, I forget the British scientist that applied it to geology, so that the different areas of the Earth, of course, are shifting, so that the Earth itself is evolving. Wow, that was incredibly revelatory, right? Then the idea of mathematics evolving with Philip Kitcher. We have the concept of the human personality evolving in your own lifetime with Freud, right? You get and language evolves with Wittgenstein. What other? So you can see that it's still constantly being applied. In fact, I think every once in a while I see something else come out that strikes me as, aha, that was another field that hadn't been touched yet. No one applied the change in paradigm to that. And now someone does, and it becomes a new book that everyone is all excited about, right? So that's kind of intriguing, how the paradigm shift. And with Mill in On Liberty, we see that same paradigm shift and its evolution of morality. The goal is to increase the overall happiness for the greatest number, including for the poor, although especially for the wealthy. But when you think about the problem with creating a narrative that explains why some things are sinful, what would be sinful in, say, the Roman Catholic point of view, many years ago, well, still today? Lust. What are the sins, right? Lust.
Pride. Yeah.
Well, I mean, there's supposedly 7 or so deadly sins. The worst sins. They've got their own interesting history, right? But lust. Think about lust. I mean, if lust was such an evil sin for a utilitarian, how could Trump get elected? If you think about it, would you say that Trump is a utilitarian? I would say yes, in just a general sense, that Trump's philosophical modus operandi is utilitarianism, or as a United States citizen, pragmatism, right? You could say that, right? And if some people get screwed, well, that's the way it goes, right? That's utility has its own set of values, right? Doctors, for example, that did experiments on patients, not just rabbits and monkeys and things of that sort, but if they literally did experiments on people, for example, the Tuskegee Airmen syphilis study is a perfect example, right? Here's an example where the doctors were clearly utilitarians, because what they thought was, well, we'll mistreat these individuals, we'll lie to them and not tell them that we're not really trying to treat their syphilis, because we just want to study them and see the progress of the disease. And that knowledge will help us then when we try to cure millions of people, right? So notice that's the same as Voldemort's, the greater good, right? We're going to sacrifice your Butsky, for the greater good. Hey, wait a minute. What if I didn't want to sacrifice my Butsky for the greater good, right? Can I say Butsky? Or should I refer to it as the Bataclan area? I don't know. That's a utilitarian problem. Because overall, the principle of utility seems to allow for you to do evil things if they're going to lead to an overall greater good. Such as using magic, as Voldemort wants, to have his power. He's overriding the Muggles, etc.
Is this where the saying "the end justifies the means" come from?
Exactly. Yeah. The end, the goal, right? End in the same sense that Fukuyama talks about the end of history. It's the aim of history, right? It's not. It's over, right? But the aim aim of our project might mean that we have to sacrifice some individuals. Maybe we have to kill family members in Osama bin Laden's family in order to make sure we get him, but that's okay, right? That's inconsequential, right? That we kill 5. From what I understand, one of a young woman was literally standing in front of him when they shot him, and they didn't say, "Move out of the way." They shot her too, right? Right. And by the way, I'm not taking a position on that as saying it was good or bad. I'm just saying this is an example of how utility works, right? And one of the issues that it has, that when we were looking at utilitarianism, it has this issue that the end justifies the means, which means that even if those means would normally have been thought of as evil in themselves, it's okay because the greater good ensues, right? That's the point of that problem, right? And by the way, the usual contrast with utility in this respect is Kant's deontology, where Kant argues that individuals have their own intrinsic value. And so I cannot use you as a means to an end. That's totally wrong, right? Because each individual has their own intrinsic value. So I can't do what they did to the men in Tuskegee to see what kind of results they were going to get, right? You know, that's wrong, right? And we have moved in that direction. You know, this kind of event was so significant because of the outcry over the way this proceeded, because we do feel that individuals ought to be valued for themselves. It's wrong to do that. But you can see this problem, you know, in all sorts of decisions. Was President Truman right in dropping the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, right? You know, it was to end the war, right? To convince the Japanese to give up. But of course, what happened was those were civilians that were killed in those towns. Another big problem would be the British and the American bombing of Dresden. You know, it was actually just about when the war was over, and it had no military value, from what I hear, and yet they totally devastated the town. Why? I think the best argument I've heard is that Churchill wanted to get even for the bombing of London. So, you know, is that utilitarian or is that just revenge? I'm not sure. My page on John Stuart. So you have a quiz question, but there's lots more about Mill that we can think about. Let me go to my notes that I have on Mill, because I have some really good notes on Mill. Okay, so John Stuart Mill, 1806 to 1873, follows Jeremy Bentham. They're utilitarians. Hedonistic calculus we talked about. They were all involved in government reforms to help the poor. And keep in mind that Karl Marx is also living in London at this time. Karl Marx had course, originally been born in Germany, went to Bonn, rather, for school, got in trouble there, so his father sent him to Berlin, so he studied philosophy in Berlin. From there, he got involved in politics and revolution, was involved in quite a few of them, enough that the Prussians kicked him out of Prussia, the Germans kicked him out of Germany, so he ended up in France. The French kicked him out of France. He couldn't go back to Germany, so he went to London. He did hope at one time to go to the United States, but they couldn't get the money to do it, so they stayed in London. He stayed in London the rest of his life. But so he's there in London, working in the library, in the British Museum Library, and that's where he wrote most of his works, the later works. It's also while he's there in Britain that he learns about economics. Most of his work is really along an economics analysis. And what he's trying to do is inspire the revolution to occur both back in Europe, but basically everywhere. The British aren't worried. Why aren't they worried? Because the British economy is doing so well. And the individuals like Jeremy Bentham and the Mill family and Charles Dickens are changing the culture in Britain so that people are concerned about the poor. And so they do change the laws, they do improve things, plus the economy is doing so well. When you look in the book on Mill, you see the great exposition that they had in London at the time. Anybody see the picture? I can't remember. It's a big glass structure that was built for the Crystal Palace in London. So it's an amazing structure. It was made out of glass, cast iron and glass, for the great exhibition of 1851. And that was a fantastic exhibition. They had all this new industrial equipment, all these new inventions and everything, and it was open to people to come. I think they did have to pay a ticket to enter, but it was millions of people came and were absolutely proud of being British, being able to produce all this stuff. So they were proud of themselves, and as a result, the revolution failed in England. It was dangerously more obviously close to success in a couple other countries. Obviously, 1917, Russia fell to the revolution, the communist revolution there, but you get the idea. Why didn't Marx have more success in England, more interest? Well, number one, he was of course German and still speaking German, and his works were primarily being published in Germany, if he could get them there. And so it took a while before it percolated through to the communities in Britain, but they weren't that interested because of the progress that they were making themselves by unions, by changing the laws in England. So communism was not that attractive theory for them. So John Stuart Mill really was kind of significant for that. Another thing is his system of logic, and that is really a very significant aspect of Mill's work. And that comes up in what's called Mill's Methods, which you could look up under that title, Mill's Methods. And basically he gives us an improved way of working on inductive reasoning. Basically, when we think of reasoning, there's several different ways of doing it. The one is deductive reasoning, which we trace that back to Aristotle. It's where you have valid forms, such as the argument, the Barbara argument, for example, Barbara, the syllogism. Barbara is the perfect argument, AAA1, for example. All men are mortal, all Greeks are men, all Greeks are mortal is your example. These are all valid forms here in this section, right? So valid means that if the premises are true, the conclusion is also true. So that's the advantage of validity. But that doesn't actually give you new knowledge, because all of the information you have in the conclusion must already be contained in the premises. So where do we get new knowledge that usually becomes the premises, like all men are mortal? Where did we learn that? We learned that from inductive reasoning, by looking around and seeing that's a guy who's mortal. Oh, he's dead. That guy's mortal. Boop, he's dead. It's right. Have you ever seen a guy that's mortal that hasn't died? Yeah, you've seen me. I haven't died yet, and in fact, I'm not planning on dying. And as a matter of fact, I'm planning on living forever, and so far, so good, right? So inductive reasoning tells you that tomorrow I will wake up and be alive, right? Perfectly good inductive argument, because every day of my life so far, I woke up and I was still alive, right? So I'm absolutely convinced that tomorrow I will wake up and still be alive, right? See, so I'll never die. That's an inductive argument. Well, the trouble, of course, with inductive arguments is several things. One is that's how we learn new information, because I perceive events and then I learn from those. That's inductive reasoning. The other problem with it is that it's invalid. It's a guess. Every single time I make an invalid a inductive conclusion about something, it's a guess, a hypothesis. It's not valid. It's not deductively sound, so that I know for sure that 2 + 2 = 4. Right? It's a guess, and the trouble with guesses, of course, is that they aren't guaranteed. And so invalid arguments have that big problem. Can you fix them? Well, that's what Mill is famous for doing, coming up with methods that will improve your inductive reasoning skills. And some of these are just absolutely hilarious, because what it demonstrates is that these very common inductive reasoning skills are new with Mill, and people were pretty darn stupid before Mill. It doesn't seem, for example, people believe that life could occur spontaneously. So if you have a damp shirt with a food source nearby, poof, you will have instant baby mice that just magically appear in the damp shirt. Right? It's just amazing. Life will just be there. We realize, of course, you need parent mice to get baby mice, but apparently, and this is 1840s. Wow, that doesn't seem really that long ago for people to think so magically, and so on. So how do we improve inductive reasoning? Well, the methods are agreement. So we look with agreement with those observations that we make. And so, when we see an agreement between certain occurrences and then a result, we make an association that we call cause and effect. When we see something that's missing and as a result the effect doesn't occur, we can make another inductive conclusion that we refer to as difference. The strongest, of course, is when you put both of those together and you get the joint method of agreement and difference. For things like weather and things of that sort, the changes that occur are constantly going up and down, and so in a sense what you're looking for are concomitant variations. Wow, it seems like when the humidity goes up, the chance of rain goes up, etc. Replicability and controls, that's where you can test and make sure that the scientist that tells you his report is being accurate. We can test what you say and make sure that what you say is right. And the controls are important. So when people think baby mice just show up in a damp shirt, we can actually put a box around the damp shirt that keeps parent mice from getting into the shirt. And then after a while we can check and see if there are baby mice there. There aren't. So that's pretty clear that you need parent mice to be able to get into there. So his book on the logic, and that's John Stuart Mill. It's a big book. A huge book. And it was very important. It still is, actually. By the way, an odd little tidbit. The author of Alice in Wonderland, Lewis Carroll, whose real name was, I always have trouble with that, but Lewis Carroll was his pen name, and it's kind of a Latinized version of his real name. But he wrote a logic book also. That's kind of interesting. And Alice in Wonderland, etc., are a bunch of logic puzzles, if you think about it. It's kind of an interesting way of teaching logic. Okay. Okay. Fun questions? See you on Thursday, I suppose. Wow, I could lose 50 pounds in 61 days with this new no exercise scheme.
Cut off your arm.
Wow. Whoa, it'll turn me from this to this.
We'll turn you into a woman.
Or this. Wow. Oh, here's
there you go.
here's some guys. Too much fun. Thank you. Was that boring?
That was awesome. No,